gentlemen, today our group AROC, including Liliana, Svalana, Brian, Morris, and me, Bonnie, we five will gonna tell you a story about the Arab Spring will not bring prosperity to Egypt. On the left side is our outline, and now I'm gonna give you a brief introduction about what Arab Spring is. Arab Spring refers to a democratic uprising that spread across the Arab world in 2011. And then what happened in Egypt? Let's see. Just inspired by a Tunisian street vendor called Muhammad, who set fire to himself. In protest of the political corruption and the ill treatment. Tens of thousands of Egyptians stood up and cried for political and economic reform. After 18 days of protest and after losing the support of military and the US government, Mr. Mubarak resigned on February 2011, ending his autocratic rule as long as 30 years of Egypt. The slogan of the Arab Spring is, the people want to bring down the regime. So what kind of regime is it that the whole nation wants to bring it down? Let's see. In the past, the Mubarak government for decades maintained a law called emergency law. What's that? It's a law that allows police to arrest people without charge and limit their limit the citizens' right to express them freely. As you can see from the pictures, many of the Egyptian people, they are suffering and live a miserable life. Then the Mubarak's policies also feed corruptions. The corruption is really severe and it hurts the economy of Egypt. In 2010, Egypt got a CPI, which is Corruption Perception Index of 3.1, and ranked 98th of a total of 178 countries, meaning that its corruption is really severe. And what happened today? After more than 8 months of Mubarak was toppled, the euphoria of Egyptians are beginning to turn into discontent. Why is that? Because let's see. First, the generals of the military of Egyptians said that they will not hold a presidential election until 2013 or even later. Before that, they want to retain full control of the government. Besides, they will appoint the prime minister and the cabinets by themselves, just like what Mubarak did before. They are exactly the same. And they give nothing but political instability to the whole Egypt. And nowadays, a growing number of Egyptian citizens, they are wondering what had happened before the so-called Arab Spring. Is it a popular revolution or is it a military coup, which maybe they traded one military autocratic regime for another one, and assumed democracy never appeared. Then I'll turn my part to Liliana to tell you something about economic policy.
Thank you, Bonnie. Economic development for Egypt has been a very long and very difficult process. Since 2004, Mubarak's reforms aimed to decrease the public sector and increase the private sector through privatization. It decreased and reduced taxes and tariffs. It also promoted the transparency of the national budget. All of these were aimed to foster the economic development and increase the competitiveness of Egypt. And as we see in the following years, the GDP increased by 7%. It also improved the investment climate in the country. And as a World Bank states, Egypt was named the champion of the economic reforms in Middle East and North Africa. However, economic policies take a very, very long time to show results. And after Mubarak resigned in January 2011, we see a complete chaos in the country. The military regime promoting the reverse of the privatization. The capital investments shrinked dramatically. The grants also, however, the subsidies increased, while we see also a decrease in trade taxes, decrease in non-tax revenues. Just by following the news, following the newspapers, media talks, we see today a new revolution is in Egypt. We see that the Arab Spring in January did not create any prosperity for Egyptians. It moreover increased the uncertainty of the country, the political and economical situation. I'll now pass to Svetlana.
Thank you, Liliana. We talked a lot about what's really happening in the country. And from this graph, you can see that there was real GDP growth. Even in 2010, there was a 5.1% increase in GDP. But what was actually the cause of that? That was supported by exports. And here you see a really nice prediction. You see Egypt rising really sharply. We'll talk about that a little later. The reality of the country was that it was ranked number 26 globally. It had a GDP of about $500 billion. But the downside was that it was ranked 103rd in personal income. The capita per GDP was a little bit over $6,000. So what are the main components of GDP? 14% was agriculture. Egypt had a monopoly on the Nile, which is no longer the case. Since the Arab Spring, 7 other countries have entered a cooperative, and now they're considering building a dam, which will actually ruin this entire 14%. The 37.5%, that's industry. That's oil, natural resources, technology. All of that was supported by foreign direct investment and infrastructure. Since the revolution, that's decreased as well. But the biggest industry was services. About half of the GDP and half of employment came from that industry. In the past couple of months, tourism alone has decreased by over 8%. That's cost the government about $1 billion. And I showed you that graph earlier with projected really steep increases in growth. Where's that coming from? That's coming from foreign investment and exports. And we've talked earlier about the political situation, the instability. We also know that the Muslim Brotherhood is gaining a lot of ground politically. And they're actually opposed to our main trading partners, the United States, Italy, Spain, India, and France. So those projections I showed you, that's dependent on having really good foreign interaction with these countries. And that's actually not the case going forward with the Egyptian government. Over to Bright.
Let's take a second to review the FDI figures for Egypt. We can see from 2007 downwards that this basically represents the trend that basically went around the world where the economic downturn, right? But you can see that from 2009 to 2010, things were actually taking off and becoming flat. But suddenly from 2010 to 2011, everything is falling sharply. There's a nosedive. Now, what does this tell us? This tells us that although the economy was taking off, FDI was stabilizing. Suddenly, because of the Arab Spring, things have suddenly, sank. What does this tell us? It tells us that, businesses are not ready to invest in Egypt now. People are taking their money out of the country. And also, you see some of the actions taken by the present transition government of rejecting an IMF loan, which doesn't bode well with international partners. Also, there's issues of safety, which is also affecting the service industry. People are not investing in resorts in the tourism sector. IT and financial sector are also interrupted. And so, also the issue of the hardliners having the possibility of taking majority in parliament is also another issue. That will also affect how businesses relate with Egypt going forward. With that, I'll hand over to Maurice to tell us what's going on currently.
Thanks, Barry. Okay. So post-Arab Spring Egypt, there's a few things happening right now. Okay. We see that the military leaders that are currently in control of Egypt was the same regime that had control while Mubarak was in power. What that means is that the constant cycle of corruption, sweetheart deals, is still going on after the Arab Spring. Also, the religious leadership that Svetlana mentioned earlier, the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic groups are taking a hold within Egypt right now. The Egyptians just went to vote yesterday, and they're going to continue to vote today. And what they're finding is that they're gaining a greater a greater hold in Egypt. What that means is that this group is typically more anti-West. So for the trading partners that Shalana mentioned, Italy, the United States, it doesn't bode well because they're going to cut off ties, which have already been seen from the rejection of the IMF loan that Bright mentioned earlier. Also, the Coptic Christians are being continuously persecuted. Now, the Coptic Christians take up about 10 to 18% of the Egyptian population. Now, to continue persecute this a whole group would not bode well for Egypt because it would not bring economic prosperity, while 18% of the population is being discriminated against. So, are the protests over? Everyone here knows that it's not over. They're still happening right now. But instead of protesting Mubarak right now, they're protesting the existing military leaders because they have not acted quickly enough. The military leaders have said that they won't relinquish power until 2013, which postpones postpones the democratic nation that the other team was talking about, which will then once that's postponed, we lose sight of the economic prosperity that we all hope for Egypt. Now, what we did was we took an example of another country who had a similar revolution. The example the country that we picked was Iran. If you notice, Iran's Islamic revolution started in 1977. From that point, where they had a GDP growth rate of nearly 18%, it dipped by about 30 points to negative 15%. You also notice that the growth rate is extremely volatile for about 20 years. Now, the question that we ask is, will Egypt meet the same fate? Now, here's Bonnie to bring us the conclusion.
Thank you, Morris. Now, given the fact that the economy of Egypt is still in stagnation, and also the Egyptian people are still suffering from the political and economic instability as a result of that Arab Spring, which brings about uncertainty in economic policies, destruction of underlying GDP component, also the diminishing of FDI and infrastructures. And according to what Morris said before, the past example of Iran, we could only say that the future of Egypt is not promising. So here again, we want to restate that the possibility of prosperity is impossible for Egypt in this current situation. That's all. Thank you.